Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Molly. I am one of the owners of Point Reyes Books, and I'm so pleased to be able to introduce two writers we love at Point Reyes Books, Katie Kitamura and Rivka Galchen. So I'm going to start with just a couple of housekeeping notes. We do have a chat on the side of the screen. Feel free to say hello, say where you're tuning in from. That's always nice to see. And also at the bottom of the screen, there is an Ask a Question feature. So the way it's going to work is we'll have a little bit of reading, a little bit of discussion, and then towards the end of this evening's event, we'll open it up for audience Q&A. So you can put a question in that Ask a Question box at any time during the conversation, and it may be answered at the end. I'm also going to give a quick overview of a few upcoming events that might be of interest. So on Wednesday, August 4th, good friend of the bookstore, Ashley Nelson Levy, joins us to celebrate the publication of her stunning debut novel, Immediate Family from FSG. We also will have acclaimed author James Rebanks joining us from the UK to discuss his new book, Pastoral Song, A Farmer's Journey, in conversation with Nick Offerman on Friday, August 6th. And on September 9th, we will be hosting Maggie Nelson for a discussion of her latest book on freedom. So these are all great events that you can find out about on our website and by subscribing to our newsletter. And we hope to see you there and at many others. But tonight we are here to celebrate the latest novel from Katie Kitamura, Intimacies, and we're so excited about this discussion. Katie will be in conversation with Rivka Galchen, who also has a new novel out called Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch. We'll see if that comes up in conversation too. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce these two. So Katie Kitamura is the author of Gone to the Forest and The Long Shot, both finalists for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award. Her third novel, A Separation, was a New York Times notable book and a finalist for the Premio von Resori. It was named a Best Book of the Year by over a dozen publications, translated into 16 languages, and is being adapted for film. Her new novel, Intimacies, was just released by Riverhead Books. Katie has written for publications including the New York Times, The Guardian, Granta, Bomb, Triple Canopy, and others, and she teaches in the creative writing program at New York University. Katie will be in conversation tonight with Rivka Galchen, an award-winning fiction writer and journalist. Her work appears often in The New Yorker, Harper's, London Review of Books, and The New York Times. She's the author of Atmospheric Disturbances, American Innovations, and Little Labors, and her latest, Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch. She has received numerous prizes and fellowships, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Rona Jaffe Fellowship, the Berlin Prize, and the William J. Saroyan International Prize in Fiction. And in 2010, she was named the New Yorker's list of 20 writers under 40. Galchen also holds an MD from Mount Sinai School of Medicine. So I, for one, can't wait to hear this discussion from these two brilliant writers. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and I'll see you at the end of the event.
Thank you so much, Molly. And hi, Rivka. It's such a treat to be here at one of my favorite bookstores with two of my absolute favorite booksellers in the world, and with one of my favorite writers and favorite people, Rivka. I'm so happy to be here, and thanks to all of you for coming. I think what we're going to do is I'll read maybe a short segment. Does that sound okay?
Sounds perfect.
Yeah, I'll read a kind of a brief section from the beginning of the book, and then I think we'll maybe chat. So the novel is about an interpreter who has moved to The Hague to take a job working at a war crimes tribunal. And this little passage that I'm going to read is just a little section on interpretation. And it's actually a story that is being told to her by a colleague who is called Amina. And I think that's all you need to know, as I say. As I sat down at my desk, I recalled an anecdote she had told me not long after I arrived at the court. It was a story I thought of often. She had been tasked with interpreting for the accused, working in Swahili, and was briefly the only interpreter on the team with adequate fluency to perform the task. Her booth partner did not have a strong grasp on the language and said in private that her mind had drifted during the lengthy sessions. She listened to the originating English and French, but less closely to Amina's interpretation. But Amina herself was under considerable pressure. She was negotiating marathon sessions that were far longer than standard. She sat in the mezzanine-level booth, the accused positioned directly below her in the courtroom. He was still a young man, a former militia leader, wearing an expensive suit and slouched in an ergonomically designed office chair. He was on trial for hideous crimes, and yet he simply looked, as he sat, sullen and perhaps a little bored. Of course, the accused are often in suits and in office chairs, but the difference lay in the fact that at the court, the accused had not merely been dressed up for the occasion, but were men who had long worn the mantle of authority conveyed by a suit or uniform, men who were accustomed to its power. And they had a kind of magnetism, in part innate and in part heightened by the circumstances. The accused had an aura when they were brought to the Hague. We had heard a great deal about these men, and they were almost always men. We had seen photographs and video footage, and when they finally appeared in the court, they were the stars of the show. There was no other way of putting it. The situation staged their charisma. In the case of this particular man, he was not only young and undeniably handsome, but he had a dazzling air of command. Even without the aid of the courtroom, it was easy to see why and how so many people had obeyed his orders. But it was not even this, Amina explained. It was the intimacy of the interpretation. She was interpreting for one man and one man alone, and when she spoke into the microphone, she was speaking to him. Of course, she had known when she had accepted the post in The Hague that the substance of the court would be darker than the United Nations, where she had previously been working. After all, the court concerned itself exclusively with genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. But she had not expected this kind of proximity, although she was never face-to-face with the accused and was always safely ensconced behind the glass-fronted interpreter's booth. She was constantly aware that she and the accused were the only two people in the courtroom who understood the language she was speaking. Over the course of those first sessions, Amina grew increasingly uneasy. The case involved a great deal of testimony regarding terrible atrocities, and hour by hour, she carried this testimony from one language into another. She found herself on occasion struggling to control the tremor in her voice. She felt herself becoming entirely too emotional. But then, as quickly as the second day, and for reasons she did not fully understand, a certain hardness overtook her. She discovered a new and acerbic tone, not exactly neutral, perhaps even reproachful. At one point, as she relayed the details of an embezzlement scheme, something that was morally questionable, but a trifle compared to the other charges against the man, she found herself using a voice of cold disapproval, as if she were a wife, scolding a husband for some small domestic failing, neglecting to do the dishes, for example, rather than addressing his rampant infidelity, or the fact that he had gambled away their life savings. At that moment, to her surprise, she saw the accused turn his head and look up in the direction of the interpreters. Until this point, he had sat almost entirely still, staring straight ahead, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with him, as if the entire matter was beneath him, although the result, Amina thought, was not the appearance of dignity. Rather, he looked like a sulky teenager being reprimanded for some infraction for which he refused to repent. There were perhaps half a dozen interpreters seated in the mezzanine-level booths. It was unlikely that he would know which one of them was his. She had never before noted him observing them. She forced herself to keep her voice steady and focus on the job at hand. The last thing she wanted to do was get distracted. Nonetheless, she was unable to keep from surreptitiously watching the accused as his gaze swept the glass-fronted booths. Perhaps feeling her eyes upon him, he suddenly stopped and looked directly at her, turning in his chair in order to do so. Amina couldn't help it. She stumbled over her words, apologized, nearly lost the thread of what was being said. He continued to stare at her, a grim expression of satisfaction settling into his handsome face, perhaps because he had succeeded in intimidating her, in causing her to falter. She felt at once, even through the glass wall dividing them, the totality of the man's will. Thanks. Sorry, I vaporized a couple moments tonight in that session.
You know what? The audio was clear the whole time, so
Okay.
So it was excellent. I love that passage so much, and it really it actually resonates through the book. It's like one of those passages, like many of the passages, it feels like like a sort of fractal that sort of fell off the book. And one of the things that kept coming to my mind as I was reading this novel, which I loved so much, was that it sort of was looking, some of the words you use in that passage are charisma and magnetism. And I kind of felt like the book again and again comes close to the kind of charisma of evil. Is that like a crazy or horrible expression? And I kept thinking that was part of why it was so engaging and kind of frightening to me. And I kind of wondered how conscious that was, and how the book's kind of seed began in terms of, I mean, there's so many things. There's the Hague Tribunal, but there's other examples of violence and kind of men becoming more charismatic when they're aggressive and when they behave badly. So I guess that's sort of where I wanted to start, was that like the central point that brought you into the book, or?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was. For me, I can sometimes remember I don't know if it's like this with you, but I can remember the exact moment when the seed of a book kind of gets thrown out, and maybe it sprouts and maybe it doesn't. But in this case, I can remember it was when I was listening to the radio and I heard Charles Taylor speaking, and he spoke in his own defense at his trial in The Hague. And, obviously he was really renowned for his oratorical skills. And there was something very, very disturbing to me about hearing him speak, because he was clearly monstrous and egomaniacal. And in some ways, nothing about what he was saying made any moral or even logical sense at all. But at the same time, there was this incredible kind of force of will and this charisma. And the feeling that I had listening to that was really, really disturbing, because I could feel myself getting drawn into his rhetoric, because he did have incredible kind of rhetorical skills. And that made me very, very uneasy. And I was really thinking about the relationship between language and charisma, and the way that, language can be used as a tool of manipulation as much as a tool of clarification. And I think that's something that I was definitely thinking in the book, is like, what are the two sides of language, and how can language sometimes elucidate a situation or actually record a situation in a relatively neutral way, and when can language actually obfuscate or provide cover. So I was definitely thinking about that kind of sickly side of charisma. And then I guess, it's referred to a little bit in that passage, but I was interested in the way that institutions and situations and pre-existing narratives create charisma in a way. So I think like the courtroom is a kind of classic example of a theatrical space, and how who we consider charismatic often depends on what role they're performing within the narration. And the people who come into these rooms, they may seem charismatic simply because we've seen their images proliferate through the news or through the world. And similarly, in some of her personal relationships, I think there are people that she finds charismatic or seductive in some way, simply because of the context in which she's meeting them. So I'm kind of always interested in how charisma is something that has to be created, that's reinforced. I think there's this narrative that people are inherently charismatic, but I think it's kind of the opposite. I think there's structures in place that create charisma, and that people can either occupy or not occupy.
Yeah, and I love the way that Amina, when she tells the story, and we hear the story from the narrator, is both like kind of vulnerable to it and aware of the way that the news clippings and everything that they had watched, and as you said, the staging is so powerful. I wanted to know how you came to the choice of having an interpreter as your perspective, because it's a wonderfully passive, in a sense, role. She's sort of coerced into saying what the translation, and you do so much with that position. So I guess I was curious to hear you think about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, I am really interested in figures who kind of act as vessels for language, or kind of conduits for language. I think maybe in part because I think that's what we're a little bit doing as novelists, is we're just kind of channeling. And I mean, especially in the case of like this most recent book that you've written, I feel like you're channeling a lot of different voices in a way, and containing voices on the page. So I think I've always been formally very interested just in what it looks like for language to pass through characters. So in A Separation, which is the book I wrote before this, the narrator is a translator. And in the project that I'm working on now, which is so early. It's so early in its life that I don't even call it like a novel. I just call it a project. But the thing I'm thinking about writing. But the character is a performer, is an actor, so she will be speaking the words of other people. So this idea initially was almost a kind of formal interest in what it means to have characters who are most at ease, or who are inside their professional role most completely when they're speaking the words of other people. But then I am very interested in passivity and how that's related to complicity. So I think one of the things about the narrator is that she, I think, considers herself to be neutral. Certainly at the beginning of the book, she kind of thinks of herself almost as a instrument of the court, almost, as a kind of like a kind of consciousness-free zone without judgment and without agency, and also without implication, without being implicated in the situation. And I think one of the things that I do feel is that when that much language is passing through you, you do become implicated in the language you speak, even if you think it's not your own language, even if it's not your own words. So I think one of the movements that the narrator hopefully makes over the course of the book is the sense that actually she is implicated, and that the neutrality that she thought came through that passivity is actually not 100% there. So that was kind of the ethical position that I was interested in thinking about, is how we're implicated in the institutions that we serve and the language that we speak as well, right? Because we're always speaking, like I always feel like language comes from somewhere and it comes from systems of power. And so what does it mean when we use that language? It actually means something. Beyond just the intention behind the sentence.
Yeah, like I feel like the narrator does reflect quite a bit about how she's not just denoting what's happening. Mm-hmm. And in that passage with Amina, I love how she does have flexibility, and she finds herself kind of imaginatively in the role of a wife, which I think gets at the weird romance.
Yes.
I wanted to ask a little bit later on in the novel, the narrator is doing translation for a Charles Taylor-like figure, it seems. Yes. And she's also in this sort of private space with counsel, and it's described the way she's basically whispering in his ear. And he seems to sort of like her. So I sort of wanted to think about how that plays. You also decided to put her narrator's situation in the context of a romance that she's going through, a sort of strange romance with a married man who's out of town, but it is like the situation in which she's in. So I was curious what came out of kind of those juxtapositions, the kind of structural romance of being the translator, mm-hmm. and the other romance in which the structure is actually gone. It's kind of a fantastical romance. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I had that kind of feeling. I mean, I love, as you might know, I I love writing kind of romances where the partner isn't present.
And there's always a mourning element as well,
which is something that I think I must not do again, because I've now done it twice, where the kind of object of longing is in some way not there. But I love it because of the kind of imaginative space that I think it opens up for the central character, who is a kind of creature. And the narrators are distinct, and they are different personalities, but they have certain things in common, and they're both. I think the narrative voice is a voice of kind of constant hypothesizing in some way, and a kind of she's constantly kind of generating possible versions of what might be happening, and there's something about doing that into a vacuum that feels kind of especially vulnerable in some way. And I think I had the feeling that once the person that she's seeing is gone, in effect, kind of ghosts her, that she would be more vulnerable to kind of a forced intimacy from another person, simply because of the way you are vulnerable. Sorry, I zapped out for a second. So I kind of wanted those there to almost be like a kind of relay race of these different relationships that would not exactly parallel each other, but that would kind of have an echo of each other. And, I had a funny experience when I finished writing the book. I just had this realization that, there's a lot of sexual harassment and sexual intimidation in the book. There's a kind of, in the middle of a book is a kind of longish section about a painting by a Dutch Golden Age painter called Judith Leyster, which is called The Proposition, which is about a young woman who's being kind of propositioned by a man. And that kind of is also a motif that kind of finds itself repeating throughout the book, I think. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to think about different kinds of intimacies. I think intimacy is something that we're to some extent conditioned to thinking about as a purely positive thing that we want from the people we love or the people around us, but it's also can be a kind of encroachment. And I think she's always, the intimacy that she feels with this former president, because she's interpreting for him, is actually not something that is desirable to her, and is actually something that makes her deeply uneasy. But it is nonetheless something that happens in the way that it happens for Amina in that scene.
Yeah, and speaking of intimacies, there's also a lot of focus, I feel like, on homes and the intimate space of a home. So the narrator is living in her boyfriend's home while he's away. And it's not just the home that he shared with his wife, which she's very aware of, but also his family home. And she does a lot of imagining of how just being a person in that kind of a space would generate a certain kind of feeling and personality in him. And then I thought it was interesting the way that connected to the narrator's sort of main friend in The Hague, works at the Moritz house, which I might be pronouncing incorrectly, but which was essentially like a home of a wealthy man that later became a museum. And that's also sort of brought up as a kind of crime for which there was no for which there was never any punishment, which I feel like is another theme in the book. So I wanted to ask how those decisions came to be, or sort of what they looked like to you after you were done writing the book, because I also feel like you've chosen to have the narrator. She's not from The Hague. She comes to The Hague. She purposely has this apartment, which is sort of undecorated, and that she doesn't really fill out with her personality, that she sort of holds her personality back. And she, compares it to her friend's apartment, which feels fully, she looks in other people's apartments and thinks about the way that they are inhabiting it. So I just wanted to think a little bit about the kind of the architectures in the book and the sense of home.
Yeah, I mean, that's I hadn't really somehow put it together, but of course the Moritz house is a kind of another addition to these homes of privilege that are throughout this story in some ways. I mean, I think it's this kind of question of who occupies what spaces and the way they occupy those spaces is something that she, as you know, she's very, very attuned to, and that's in some way something that she doesn't know how to do. I think as a character, she doesn't actually know how to occupy space, and that's something that when she looks at Adriaan, who is her kind of sort of ghostly boyfriend who lives in this house, she really notes that there's a kind of intergenerational wealth that's happening as well. It's a house he grew up in, and this question of what does it mean to have had a purchase on a space for so long. Her friend Jana is different. She's somebody who's kind of bought a very, very small apartment in a kind of rapidly gentrifying part of the town, which has its own complexity to it. But even that, she notes that she's able to claim her space. And I think that's something that the narrator really, really struggles with throughout the novel. And she kind of looks with envy at people who are able to do that with so much ease. And I think, part of that is just like, I feel like that. I'm not one of these people, there are people who know how to make, who either who literally have, a large home, or there are people who just know how to make a home around them. And I think that's something that the narrator, she really has neither of those things. But I will say, like with Adriaan's apartment, my main reference point in writing that is I reread Rebecca, and that
wow.
idea, and so it was like that little apartment was in my head, like the kind of Manderley, which is a space that's haunted by all these other, by the character of Rebecca herself, by the housekeeper, like I wrote in a little housekeeper because of, as a reference to Mrs. Danvers. And I had it actually written, like named within the novel initially. I had a kind of little riff on Rebecca, and then I just felt too heavy-handed, so I took it out. But that was the kind of reference point for it, was because I think, among other things, that really is a melodrama. And one thing that I wanted to play with was the way that something that's very, very ordinary, which is somebody not texting you back, which happens all the time, and we're all also guilty of failing to text people back, but how in the head of the narrator that gets spun kind of out of proportion, almost into this intense melodrama. And it's, I think, one of the incongruities that she has to negotiate is the fact that there is this kind of large history-making narrative at work, which she has some access to, and then there's also this very small, petty, in some ways superficial story about her personal relationship. And in her experience, in her subjective experience, those two things, occupy almost the same space. And I think that's how a lot of us exist. We're very aware of the larger narratives, but the small things also preoccupy us maybe more than we feel they should.
That's so interesting, especially because I feel like being interested in her own love life seems totally fair. Like it would make sense that it would take up a lot of space, but that's an interesting idea that that's a failure, or an exaggeration. One thing I love in the book is the voice, and I was trying to actually understand. We all read like a little bit sort of like sympathetically, like what are they going to do? I'm sort of worried for them, or like how are they building this voice? And I was thinking like this voice really manages to make me anxious very early on, and also feel like slightly like I'm missing cues or missing signals. And I was trying to think what that was. And one small technical thing I noticed that you did is nothing in the whole book is in quotes. Everything that she says, people said, and when she's speaking and other people speaking, it's all kind of feels like muted, I think, because of the lack of quotes. And was that obvious to you that it was going to be that way, that the voice was going to flow in that way?
I think I knew that I wanted all of the dialogue to pass through the narrator in some way, so that it would all be reported rather than direct, or I wanted it to all feel reported rather than direct. I think there are actually instances where it's just the dialogue, but I wanted it to feel like it was all being filtered through her subjectivity. And to some extent, I think people find the book a little stressful or tense in some way.
Yeah.
And I don't really know exactly why that is in some ways, but I think some of it has to do with the uncertainty that's in the narration itself, I think, because there's very little that she takes for granted, and it's often like if she has a statement A, she'll unwind it with like a circle and then like another circle, so there's not that much steady ground in the novel. And the working title for this book for a very, very long time was Terra Firma, which was always this idea of the kind of narrator trying to reach this kind of stable ground. And in the end, we lost that, and it became Intimacies, which I much prefer now as a title. But for a long time, it was about this kind of almost I wanted the narration to have this almost seasick quality of constant movement.
That's really interesting that was the title, because I don't think I'm giving anything away, but part of the arc of the novel is that the narrator is able to sort of reclaim a piece of the Hague, a literal sort of piece of the Hague in the dunes. And, that was something that didn't have to be in there, in the sense that she doesn't really know why she chooses this particular escape from New York, or how, it seems like she feels like she's made an almost random decision, and then it seems the decision isn't so random at all. So I guess I was curious about when you knew that it would be set in The Hague. Did that follow just from hearing Charles Taylor, or I wonder how that came about, because there could be so many places and perspectives to kind of investigate that proximity to that kind of ickiness of charisma, as you put it.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I decided to set it in The Hague, and then I did all because of the ICC, the International Criminal Court is there, and that was a primary reason. And then I did all the novelty things, and I went to The Hague, and I spent a couple of weeks there, and I sat in fact, Laurent Gbagbo's trial, who is a little bit the model for the former president who appears in the book. And I did all the stuff. I found the neighborhoods
fun.
where my character would be leaving. All of that stuff. And then I went home and I wrote a draft of the book. And then when I finished the draft, I realized that I'd spent 2 summers there as a child with my family.
And you'd forgotten. Yeah.
And I'd completely forgotten. And for years, I don't know if you've read The Kingdom, the Carrère novel, autofiction, nonfiction. Anyway, it's a book about faith and he's kind of trying to understand, trying to believe, and trying to kind of understand what it means to have religious faith. And then kind of a third of the way through the novel, he says, I forgot that I was intensely religious between the ages of 14 and 16. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like one of these moments where he says, 80 pages, and he said, it was so strange. I completely forgot I was intensely religious.
A priest.
I was virtually, and I would pray daily, and he had and I thought, how on earth could you forget something like that? But in fact, I had forgotten that I'd spent this time in The Hague with my family, and then all of these, it really was quite magical. All of these memories that were very free floating, and I kind of knew they were in Holland somewhere, in the Netherlands somewhere, but I didn't know exactly what. I suddenly realized I could go to a map of The Hague and say it was there, and that theme park was there, and this, the train station is here. They all kind of fell into place, and so I gave that feeling to my narrator. That was not in the first draft of the book, but I went back and I wrote it in, and it was just, I felt like it was a case of, rationally, the reason to set it in The Hague was because all of these tribunals are there, but there was some other reason, because I feel like there's always a reason why, when you're writing a book, you want to spend time in that world, and you may not know what it is until you're kind of quite a ways through the book. But in the end, that was a reason why, and it was, in fact, a lot of those memories were about my father, and my father died 10 years ago, so it was it kind of had a vibration for me, I think.
That's sort of that's so powerful and makes so much sense. That there's sort of the overt reason why you're writing a book, because there's a million interesting stories in the world. There's a million interesting things to think about. And why do you land on one versus another? And that there's that sort of covert reclamation of sort of
Well, I think
memories.
there's always the idea that you think is technically or research wise or thematically interesting enough to write a book, but the one that will actually get you to do the work of writing a book is you have to want to go back to that world. You have to want to occupy that space for however many hours or days, months, years it takes to actually write your book.
I also, you mentioned earlier the scene where she sort of, she's at the Moritz house at a kind of opening, and she stops in front of the painting that you mentioned and is really struck by it and processes it for a while. And in terms of kind of the way that time is managed in the novel, there's this wonderful dilation there. And I don't know exactly how many pages it is, but in terms of kind of words per minute in the kind of a diegetic time of the novel, it's a lot. So it felt so natural, and it almost felt like a kind of hinge. So I was kind of curious when you learned about that painting, and what it was like to try and describe it, because I also think describing a painting is it's a classic challenge, but it's really a challenge, and it usually doesn't work because you have to somehow animate the space between the painting and the person looking at it. And it is like a marvelous passage, and I remember it so well. So I guess that's not really a question, but I wanted to know how the painting came in to the novel for you. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny that you use the word hinge, because that scene was always going to be the halfway point in the book for me. Like 100%, I always knew it was going to be in the middle of the book, and I was in the first half I was writing toward it, and the second half I was writing away from it in some way. And I also knew that that's the moment where there's a biggest jump in time. Like it's kind of like a moment where when you hit that scene, it's a kind of moment where she goes, weeks have passed or whatever. So I knew that the sense of time would have to also be different from the way it was elsewhere in the novel. I mean, I find writing about art in general very, very difficult. And it's something that I've kind of done a lot of. I've written a lot of art criticism for art, kind of specialist art magazines. And I find it really, really hard to do. It's very hard to describe what you're looking at. And obviously, ideally, the quality of the work is exactly what eludes a kind of written form. It can only take place in a kind of visual way. But I think in the case of that particular scene, I knew I had a set of ideas which had to do with institutions and access and kind of general context for art in general, because I think that the whole novel is concerned with power, who has access to power, who has access to the institutions, who gets to be in the room, who doesn't get to be in the room, who is in the room but is essentially
unseen. Who gets to avoid the room.
Yes, exactly. I mean, exactly, like all those questions. And I think, in that scene at the Moritz house opens with the narrator talking about her friend who's been kind of tasked with bringing in new audiences into this kind of old state museum, and then from there, once I could feel that I could kind of go into the history of the Moritz house, which was, as you mentioned, was a house of Johann Moritz, who was a slave trader and a colonialist, and then he founded it or donated it or became the space of the museum. But only very, very recently was that history kind of looked at and contextualized. Very recently. I think, at the time, the novel is set in 2016, and the bust of Johann Moritz at that time was absolutely in the museum without context. And now I believe there has been a dialogue around it, and there is kind of contextualizing material around it. But in 2016, there really, really wasn't. So I think that all filtered into that particular painting, because when I looked at that painting, I realized that was also an opportunity to kind of talk about some of the themes in the work. I'm relieved to hear that you think it's okay, because obviously you're such a brilliant artist yourself, and it's quite stressful for to wonder if you've managed to communicate what the piece is without obviously being able to show it.
Another kind of like symmetry in the book. I mean, there's the hinge, and then one of the symmetries is we had mentioned earlier, like there's a lot, and again, I don't think I'm giving anything away, but it's a lot of crime and violence for which there is no sort of justice. And then there's also a crime that doesn't happen. And it's sort of brought up quite early, and it's sort of the fact that it has never happened is revealed much later. And in fact, sort of the whole story about sort of why this was invented, or might have been invented by the person who wasn't attacked in the way they said they were. I mean, there is a crime, and I'm not summarizing it very well, but it seemed like an interesting element to make sure that you have in there, because it's made very clear that a lot of the crime. Sorry, I go to bed at 8:30, so it's like a little hard for me over here. But anyways, I just sort of wanted to think about that, because especially in this book, like most of the crimes, as is mentioned, most of the war criminals tried at the Hague are men, and most of the violent and aggressive behavior in this book is by men. But then there's one man who's sort of physically vulnerable, the brother of one of her friends. And yet you do something interesting with that character. And then you sort of flip the violence a little bit. So I guess I was curious, like, how that came in. Did it come in organically? And it also structures the novel because it's the first thing that seems, it's the first worry. When her friend is worried about her getting home safe at night, it seems because she's thinking about this crime that didn't quite happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was, I guess, another starting point for the novel was the idea of how these characters might be implicated in something that happens very close to where they are, whether that's because they are gentrifiers in some way, or because they have, she chooses to get close to the sister of the person she thinks is the victim, and what is beyond that, what is behind that impulse, what is behind that desire for closeness to calamity, I think was something that I wanted to think about. I mean, with the last two books, I've really enjoyed, maybe just me, I mean, I might be the only person enjoying it, but I've enjoyed kind of using certain genre elements. And there's so many of the writers who really are, for me, touchstones, whether it's, Marguerite Duras or Modiano or Javier Marias, they all play around with these kind of genres. They kind of deconstruct mysteries, or they deconstruct thrillers, or there are crimes that take place, but they're never exactly in the way that you think they are, or the novel kind of loses interest in really telling you who committed the crime. And it's more just kind of opening up a kind of opening up a kind of. I mean, I find that with like Modiano's
in that way too. Yeah.
They kind of, there is a crime, but then somehow the narration shifts away from it, and I really like the idea that what is the kind of territory is not, the narrative territory is not in plot, but is in the interiority of the characters in some way. And so in the case of that one, I think it kind of all unfolds into the question of what she actually thinks she's witnessed, and what the implications of that are. I mean, that character of Anton, I loved writing him so much. He was so much fun it was actually Hari, my husband, who is my first reader, when he first read the draft, he's like, "You just love this character too much, and you have to." He said,
he's also an amazing storyteller.
He was like, "You've got to rein him in, because I feel like the whole novel could fall into like his." There was so much more of that. I mean, I wrote chapters and chapters. I was just completely I just had so much. And that's like one of the interesting things about writing is, of course, so much of it is intuitive, and you're following what delights you and what interests you as a writer. But then in the editing, you just kind of sometimes, somebody has to come in and say, you're losing the shape of this because it's your kind of preoccupation, or your affinity with a character has you've let it run away. So I pared it much back, so he's really only in 2 scenes rather than, like, I don't know, 15 or something like that.
That's so funny.
But he was a character that I really loved. I loved writing a lot. I know that wasn't your question. I feel like he gets
punted. No, but I feel like it's interesting because I feel like when he's sort of in his own space, he has like his full light. And then when later in the book, she catches sight of him in a restaurant when he doesn't want to be seen. And
yes.
And he seems so pathetic and grotesque. I feel like you were taking revenge on him for being too interesting or trying to take over the book.
I mean, yeah. I mean, although I also had fun writing that scene as well. Yeah, I did. Do you have that? Are there kind of voices in Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch that you just had to rein in because they were too much fun for you?
I feel like I'm always wrong about the parts of my own book that are like extremely boring or kind of fun because, the parts that you've gone over 1,000 times are so like repulsive to you at the end. Or for me, like eventually, like the parts I've worked on the hardest are really repulsive. And the parts that I just somehow was like, came out more quickly, I'm like, this is amazing. And then I feel like for a reader, I'm usually get feedback of the opposite. I'll be like, well, you'll sort of wade through this part, but you'll really love this part. And I'll always feel like, could we just get rid of more of this, all my favorite things. So I've decided that like there's a process of writing a book. I don't know. And it sounds like you're this way a little bit too, where you start out as like the best reader for the book and eventually you become the worst.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I absolutely feel that. You're too invested in your relationship to certain characters. But Rivka, because I know we're reaching the end of our hour, I did want to ask you, and I apologize because I know you will have answered this question a million times in your events, but I know you did a lot of kind of archival research in while you were writing the book, and I guess I just wondered how you found the voice. And I apologize, that's such a kind of fanny question to ask, but like how did you find Katarina's voice? Was that the result of kind of,
intense labor?
Did you just have it from the beginning, or what how did that happen?
Yeah, you were mentioning that sort of like you were hesitant to mention your project because it was still just a seed, and the way that for you to actually spend time writing something, you have to be kind of like overwhelmed and want to go there a lot, and you don't even know why. And I definitely felt that way with that project because actually there's almost no record of Katarina's voice because she, one, was illiterate and she couldn't write, and even in the trial, the book is sort of about her being accused as a witch and going on trial. And even in the trial, although you have detailed transcriptions of what most of the witnesses said, all you know from her is like, she says, I can't cry she's supposed to cry to show how bad she feels. And she says, I can't cry because I've already cried too many tears in my life. That's basically all we know she said. And one other point, like she's in jail and she's like, I'd like some eggs and some nutritious food. That's all you hear her say. But I found her voice was like, for some reason, like the one thing that I had no doubts on. I kind of felt that I knew what type of person I had in mind. And I'm not saying it's the real historic person, but it was very clear to me. And it was like a little bit people in my life and a little bit kind of Leonora Carrington characters and a little bit of the historical record kind of come. But it was somehow, that was the easy part. In a nice way.
And then did the transcripts come into? It's interesting because I also looked at a lot of. This is actually, I hadn't realized the similarity in our books.
We both have trials.
But we both have trials.
You're pink and I'm purple. So like,
and our covers matched. But yeah, I looked at a lot of transcripts as well because in the ICC do this extraordinary thing where they just post everything online, so you can just like you can click and you have thousands of pages of transcripts from all of the trials, which I found just incredibly useful, almost the most useful thing about all the research. Like, of course, being there and seeing the kind of atmosphere and all of that was very useful, but it was actually the language of the transcripts that I felt like gave me access to understanding obviously I don't fully understand it, but understanding the spirit of the institution in some way. And I wondered if the transcripts for you in the same way, even if they didn't have Katarina's voice, I refer to her, on a first name basis, but even if they didn't have her voice, if they
judge,
if they kind of filled in the other characters for you or
it was incredible. Good fortune to have the full transcripts, which we only have really because her son is so famous. So in the kind of contained volume of anything that Kepler ever said or ever did, which also is available online, they just have they have everything from the trial, the letters. So it's kind of sometimes I felt bad. I thought people should just read this. This would be a great book or whatever. But I like to think I added something. But yeah.
But I mean, you gave her the voice that she didn't. Sorry to sound cheap.
I gave her the voice.
True.
I gave her the voice she didn't have.
It's true.
Anyways, I do want to say I love all of your work, but it was like amazing to have this chance to talk to you, because even though I think of you as a wonderful friend, I'm too shy to ever ask you anything about how you put these things together. So
I'm the same, Rivka. I'm 100% the same.
Molly, thank you for bringing us together in your bookstore room.
In our bookstore. This is what it is. Well, I can't wait until we can all be together in our actual bookstore or anywhere that's possible. Yes. That would be really wonderful. I'm going to elevate one question that was asked down below, but I'm going to sort of, so this is a question from Yasmin, who was hoping that you could speak more to the passage. I understand, I could understand anything under the right circumstances, and for the right person, it is both a strength and a weakness. I'm not sure how specific you want to get in addressing this question, but this is the line that Yasmin would like to hear more about.
I mean, I think one of the recurring, thank you, Yasmin. I think it's funny because that line is one of these, I think it's some, so for me, I don't know, I'm sure, Rivka, it's different for you, but for me, like the kind of set pieces are the easiest thing to write, like the kind of courtroom scene or the party scene or the opening. And the hardest thing for me is actually the interstitial work, which often creates the emotional through line for the novel. And that is actually a line that I added in on a second or third draft to kind of try to underline the emotional state of the narrator. And that is something that she thinks in relationship to her, to Adriaan, who is her boyfriend, or her ghostly boyfriend. And I think, but it speaks to what is the underlying theme, I think, in the book, which is this question of empathy, and how empathy is a kind of double-edged sword and is not always the correct ethical response. And I think, we're kind of taught so much that empathy is desirable, and if you just have more empathy, or it's something that we are constantly urging on people, but something that the narrator really experiences again and again is that there are actually real complexities and complications to that empathy, certainly when she's experiencing it in relationship to the former president who she is interpreting for. And I think what she realizes in that moment is that it's similar with her relationship. I think she would be capable of understanding his situation, which is both something that might allow her to move forward with this person, but is also something that maybe might put her in a position, where she's too accepting or she's too sympathetic.
Sorry. Here we are at home. Perfect note to remind us all that we are not just in this sort of magical space of intelligent conversation. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Katie and Rivka, for that fantastic conversation. I hope it inspired everybody to buy and read these books. There's a link to buy the book from Point Reyes Books at the bottom of the screen, or please pick them up from your local independent bookstore. And again, I can't wait till we can do this again in person in some combination someday. And thank you so much.
Rivka, Molly, thank you so much. This was such a treat. I really am grateful.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Molly.
Wonderful evening. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.